احنا حركة نسائية تكونت في بريطانيا، مجموعة من النساء البريطانيات كونا حركة اسمها حركة Safe Women and Children from Oppression. الحركة هي حركة عالمية تهتم بقمع المرأة والطفل نتيجة للآراء السياسية في أي مكان في العالم، سواء في مصر أو في غزة أو في العراق أو في أفغانستان. أي مكان تقمع فيه المرأة أو الطفل نتيجة للآراء السياسية، فإحنا بنناصر يعني هؤلاء النساء والأطفال. هدفنا الأساسي هو هدف توعوي للشارع الأوروبي أو الشارع الأمريكي في لما يحدث للمرأة من قمع نتيجة والطفل نتيجة للآراء السياسية، سواء كان هذا القمع بالتعذيب أو بالاغتصاب كما يحدث. فاليوم مثلا هو المؤتمر هنا مخصص لمصر. الجميع يعرف أن بعد انقلاب 3/7 وسيطرة العسكر على الحكم وعزل أول رئيس منتخب دكتور محمد مرسي، ما حدث للمرأة والطفل. طبعا نحن نتكلم عن الطفل تبعا للقانون المصري، أي إنسان تحت سن 18 سنة فهو طفل. فبالتالي ما يحدث للمرأة والطفل في مصر هذه الأيام لا يقبله عقل. هناك حالات موثقة، حالات اغتصاب، حالات تعدي، ضرب عنيف. والاغتصاب لم يقتصر على النساء فقط ولكن أيضا تعدى للأطفال. وما يفعل ومن الذي يفعله هو الأثوريتي المصرية، the Egyptian authority، البوليس المصري والعسكر.
It is amazing to me how little the international media speaks about what has happened to the Egyptian people, especially the women and children. So many of them have been thrown in prison by the Sisi regime, have been raped, have been tortured. The Amnesty report that came out and the Human Rights Watch report came out showed that the regime of Sisi is worse than the Mubarak regime in terms of how it's treating its prisoners. Also the fact that there is a law in place that makes it illegal to have a protest without permission from the government means that when women go out on the street to protest, they are subject to arrest and imprisonment. So there is no right to free speech, there is no right to free assembly, there are no basic freedoms at all. And the courts are a total joke. There is no real due process. In fact, there are over 1,000 people who have been sentenced to death without a chance to even defend themselves. So I would say that it's a regime that has been very cruelly repressive against all of its people, especially the women. I think it's important to tell people that there are Americans in this case who don't agree with our government policy of becoming close to this Egyptian regime, that we recognize it as a coup, even if our government won't call it a coup, that we're very upset about our tax dollars going to support the Egyptian military, and that we will work very hard to try to break the relations between our government and the government of Egypt. According to U.S. law, and most of the laws in the European countries, when there is a military coup, our governments are not supposed to be supportive of a government that comes to power in a violent way, overthrowing a democratically elected government. We would like our countries to obey their own laws.
الندوة النهاردة كانت مخصصة لحقوق الإنسان والحريات في مصر، وخاصة إحنا مجموعة بنشتغل أساسا من أجل النساء والأطفال في مصر، وبنعتبرهم إن هم أضعف أعضاء في المجتمع المصري لعدة أسباب. فإحنا النهاردة استفدنا جدا من وجود ميديا بنجامين اللي هي الناشطة الأمريكية، عندها خبرة كبيرة في المجال العمل الإنساني والعمل الحقوقي، وأخذنا منها كتير من النصايح إزاي إحنا نقدر نشتغل، إزاي إحنا نقدر نكبر المجموعة بتاعتنا، إزاي إن إحنا نقدر نوصل صوت اللي ملهمش صوت في مصر وخاصة النساء والأطفال هنا للعالم الخارجي، ونجيب نخلي القضية بتاعتهم يعني في مركز الاهتمام، يعني ما تروحش في وسط القضايا السياسية وقطع الكهرباء والناس مش لاقية تاكل والحاجات دي. فيه أعتقد حقوق الإنسان وخاصة حقوق المرأة والطفل لازم يبقوا at the top of the agenda، يعني على أول أولويات. ميديا الحقيقة اهتمامها أساسا هي مع مناشطة سلام، وهي اهتمامها بمصر جزء من اهتمامها بالميدل ايست، الميدل ايست ان جنرال، يعني اللي هو الشرق الاوسط عامه. هي بدات اساسا نشاطها عشان حرب العراق، وعلشان هي بتشتغل بتدعو للسلام وبتدعو لبعد الحكومه الامريكيه عن الحرب، فبالتالي بدات في العراق، اشتغلت مع غزه فلسطين، دلوقتي بتشتغل معانا في موضوع مصر.
So my name is Medea Benjamin, and I live in Washington, D.C. I'm part of a mostly women, but like your group, Men Allowed, an organization that started after the 9/11 attacks, trying to stop the U.S. from invading Iraq. One has to look back now and think how different the world might be if only George Bush and Tony Blair had listened to the millions of people who came out onto the streets to say no to that war. And I'm really delighted to be with you today. My organization uses the color pink because it was a play on the color-coded terror system that George Bush put in place. And I see that you have the color purple, and it's a beautiful color. I think it goes very well with pink, and it would be nice for us to find ways to work together. One of the ways that we have worked together with women's groups around the world is around Gaza. And before this last vicious Israeli attack, we had gone to Gaza 8 times. My husband here is somebody who's put a lot of time and effort into organizing trips to Gaza. And for International Women's Day this year, March 8th, we had planned to take a group of 100 women from around the world to Gaza. And we were on our way. I was setting up the logistics, so I was going early. And I arrived at the airport in Cairo thinking that everything was just fine. I handed in my passport, and suddenly I was swept away, taken to a detention place where I was held for 17 hours, never told what was wrong with a person who's dedicated her life to peace. And then 5 men came in and attacked me, threw me on the ground, stomped on my back, pulled my arm so violently that it came out of its socket. And when I was screaming from the pain, they took the scarf I was wearing and stuffed it in my mouth, and then dragged me through the halls of the Egyptian airport to throw me onto a plane to be deported. The staff in the plane said I was in no condition to be put on a plane. I had to go to a hospital, and the Egyptian security would not let me go to a hospital, made me go on the plane like that. I realized that this is a government in Egypt right now that is not a normal government. This is not a democratic government. This is not a government that has any respect for anybody's rights. Here I am, I'm 61 years old, I'm an American, I'm a peace activist, and I'm a woman. And I thought maybe one of those things would protect me, but certainly it didn't do that. It made me so angry, it also opened my eyes and made me want to know, what is this government doing to its own people, if it would do that to me? And the more I looked, the more horrified I became. And I am totally horrified that this government that came to power through a coup would be able in the ensuing year to get away with putting 40,000 people in jail for their political beliefs, to sentence over 1,200 people to death sentence people to death in trials that make a mockery of the whole justice system, where the prisoners are not even allowed to be at their own trial and their lawyers are not allowed to give any defense. I see how this regime has put journalists in prison, like the Al Jazeera journalists, and given them sentences of 7 to 10 years in jail for only exercising their jobs. And so this is a government that should have been cut off from the rest of the civilized world. And instead, what has happened? Well, I look at my own government, the United States, which has for decades been supporting repressive governments in Egypt, decades been supporting the Mubarak regime. And here, after a coup, the US government would not even call it a coup, refused to say the word coup. Why? Because there are consequences of using the word coup. If you say the word coup, that means that the US government is not able to give money to a government that came to power overthrowing a democratically elected government. There are laws against that. But if you don't call it a coup, you can find ways around it. And that's what the US government is doing now. The $1.3 billion a year that the American government gives to Egypt is to shore up the Egyptian military. It doesn't go to feed starving people. It doesn't go to fix the electricity plant that is now keeping people in the dark. It is going to weapons. And instead of cutting off the money to this treacherous regime, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, has gone to Egypt, shook hands with Sisi, and told him that he was releasing half of the funds and that he was sure that the rest of them would be released. Now, I have gone many times, along with my colleagues, to Congress to demand that the money be cut off. And what they tell us is, oh, well, you have to understand that the arrangements we have with Egypt go back to the days of the Camp David Accord. And one of the main concerns of the US government is not the Egyptian people, it's the Israeli people. And that they want Egypt to continue to work with Israel to repress the Palestinian people. And we saw that in full swing during this last invasion of Gaza, where the Egyptians made it even more difficult for people inside Gaza. They had nowhere to turn, nowhere to go. We know that thousands of them were killed. They couldn't even leave through the border with Egypt because the Egyptians sealed off that border. We were also told by our representatives that it is important for Egypt to give priority access to U.S. ships that go through the Suez Canal. And this is particularly U.S. warships as well as U.S. commercial ships. So the interests of our war machine as well as the interests of the businesses are more important than the well-being of the Egyptian people. And the other thing we are told is that the Egyptian money is really not going directly to the Egyptian military. Most of it is going to U.S. military companies that want to sell weaponry to Egypt. And so it's really just a way of subsidizing U.S. corporations. In fact, there are hundreds of tanks that are being sold to the Egyptian military that the Egyptian military doesn't even want. They already have several hundred tanks that are just sitting in Egypt in storage that have never been used. But the US companies want to continue selling those because it's big business. The same thing for the F-16 fighter jets. The Egyptian military says it doesn't need any more fighter jets. It is not fighting a war with fighter jets. And it has more than it needs, but the U.S. companies want to keep selling them. So really, this money is taken from the pockets of the American people and given to companies in the U.S., and this is part of keeping the repressive apparatus going in Egypt. So one of the main things that we are trying to do as activists is to expose the complicity between the U.S. government, U.S. weapons manufacturers, and the Egyptian military, and to try to find allies within Congress to stop that, because it is so important to not give legitimacy to the Egyptian government by continuing this aid. And the other thing is, I think that John Kerry, our Secretary of State, during the Israeli invasion of Gaza, conferred legitimacy on Sisi by using Egypt and Sisi as the mediator in the conflict to come up with the ceasefire. And we were out on the street saying no to the invasion of Gaza, but also no to using Egypt as a mediator. Egypt is no mediator. Egypt is part of the conflict, just like the U.S. is part of the conflict on the side of Israel. So lastly, I just want to say that I think it's so important that we do educational work, that we let people know how vicious this Egyptian regime is, because our mainstream media, with the exception of Al Jazeera, is not getting this information out. That we reach out across borders, particularly women to women, to find ways to be in solidarity with the women in Egypt, just like we want to be in solidarity with women in Gaza and women in Iraq and women in Syria. There are so many women that are suffering throughout the Middle East today. And I am anxious to get to the part of the discussion about where we go from here, because it's important not just to educate, but also to do actions. And we in Code Pink take this seriously. We are constantly in front of the Egyptian embassy in Washington, D.C. We are constantly outside of the companies that are working with Egypt to try to cut them off. And we are constantly working to find ways to say to our brothers and sisters in Egypt that even though our government is cozying up to this regime, we, the American people, will not, and we will continue to work in solidarity with you until there is a change in government and Egypt can get back on the track of a real democracy. Thank you.
احنا عارفين ان النظام في مصر نظام قمعي واستبدادي وان الحقيقه الوضع في مصر سياسيا واقتصاديا سيء جدا، لكن اضافه لكده انه النساء في سجون مصر بيتعذبوا وبينتهكوا، وان الاطفال كمان بينتهكوا. ده شيء يعني غريب، وانه دلوقتي ده بيصدر عن نظام يعني بيحاول يبين وجهه مقبوله للغرب. ده شيء مش مقبول هنا في الغرب. والناس اللي اتكلمت النهارده بكل وضوح انها كشف النظام ده، وانها مستعده تعمل في مجال مش بس النسائي بس على مستوى المجتمع المدني عشان توضح الحقيقه اللي بتحصل في مصر. وان المساله دي مش بس بتخص بس نساء مصر، بس انه في نساء في كل انحاء العالم مستعدين يقفوا مع نساء مصر، والانتهاكات اللي بتحصل في السجون وخارج السجون. يعني اللي حصل في مصر من ناحيه انتهاكات وخصوصا في رابعه يعتبر انه جرائم ضد الانسانيه. واحنا شفنا تقرير هيومن رايتس واتش بكل وضوح بيقول ان عبد الفتاح السيسي وابراهيم واخرين مسؤولين على الانتهاكات والاوامر اللي صدرت اللي هي سببت الجرائم ضد الانسانيه، وان المجتمع الدولي مسؤول ان يحقق وان يشوف مين المسؤول، وان الشعب المصري والعالم كله ليه الحق ان يعرف وانه يحاكم المسؤولين.
Let me just try to put some of what was said earlier in some kind of political context. Both Medea and Mona pointed to the military regime in Egypt as being really responsible for the level of repression against women today. It is the very nature of this authoritarian regime that oppresses its own people that has allowed the systematic, and I use the word systematic on purpose, the systematic, organized and planned repression of women on a daily basis. This is not just random behavior by some thugs. This is policy. This is part of Egyptian policy. There may be random acts of abuse, yes. But this regime in Egypt, under Sisi, wants to foment a situation where Egyptian society fears the regime. Through fear, it wishes to contain the population from resorting to opposition on the streets or through any other means. So fear and repression are used as a weapon of containment and control. So there is no reason to suppose that this sort of repression will end. What women have suffered in Egypt over the past year since the coup is, I believe, a kind of repression that will continue and may escalate wherever there is opposition to the regime. So the question then is, will this opposition eventually cower and submit to the measures of torture, arbitrary arrest, even shootings of protesters, the kind of intimidation that families undergo? I believe not, because I think that repressive regimes will find opposition in their midst, especially in a country like Egypt, where the barrier of fear, I think, was broken quite clearly with the revolution of January 25th. And what the present regime is trying to do is trying to instill that fear that has existed under dictatorship for 60 years. Some say it has succeeded in certain quarters, but the very fact that voices remain high, that people continue to come out, that we keep saying an escalation of these abuses and violations, says that women and men are refusing to go home and give up. They're continuing to come out and to resist. I believe that resistance will grow as the political and economic situation in Egypt deteriorates. Even for those that welcomed the Sisi regime, I think many realize that they were mistaken. There's still a good level of support for him, but I think many realize that they were mistaken, that the economic situation is dire, that the security situation is also in danger, that society itself is being affected. So what is happening is not just on the political level. There is a fragmentation on a societal level. When you have a regime that discriminates against one group, that continues to repress in the name of a war on terror and a war on one particular group, when actually it is attacking anyone who opposes it, whatever their ideological leanings, you have a problem with a system that does not want to integrate its society into any kind of political process that is either representative or will allow it to be held accountable. On the contrary, it is a kind of political system that wants to continue to control through any means possible, and will continue to find itself, the regime, will continue to find itself isolated and cornered. Now, that will happen internally. But what is very important is also what happens outside Egypt on the international level. And I think that the level of awareness of what's happening in Egypt is increasing, despite the fact that governments like the United States and the United Kingdom and the EU continue to support the Sisi government. There is discomfort with the level of violations. And we have seen, obviously, with the recent Human Rights Watch report, a clear example of the level of violations, and also a pointing of the finger directly to Sisi, to the Interior Minister Mustafa Ibrahim, and to others, and a call on the international community to hold those responsible to account for the violations that happened in Rab'a and elsewhere in Egypt. Now, this is a very important development that has to be taken very seriously by all those who realize the danger of the Egyptian regime on security both in Egypt and beyond Egypt. And I think it has exposed the regime to a level of criticism that is now documented by an independent and respected organization such as Human Rights Watch. We need to be able to build on that. So the battle is both political and it is also one about women's rights and human rights. And the message I think that needs to go out very clearly to civil society, to NGOs, to women's groups, in whatever country we live in the world, is that this man at the helm of Egypt and the regime and those who support him are abusers. They are abusers of women's rights, abusers at every level. They have allowed rape in prison, they have allowed torture, they have allowed the abuse of men, women, and children. They have violated them in every possible way. That this kind of abuse, if it is committed by an individual in the United Kingdom, he would be under arrest. So to allow a man like Sisi to visit the United States and to speak at the United Nations, so it should be something that should be opposed, not just on political grounds, but on human grounds and criminal grounds. This man is a criminal. He is in the same light that in this country, recently, the BBC's Jimmy Savile was accused of abusing young children. Would we allow him into a forum like this to speak? The abuse committed by the so-called head of state of Egypt is of equivalent abuse, I believe. It is systematic governmental abuse of women's rights and bodies. He should not be allowed to enter the states of the democratic world, and he should not be allowed to speak at the United Nations. And I say this to you, Medea, because I'm lucky to be with you on the same panel, and I know you are returning to the United States. I think the message should be loud and clear to all women's groups and other groups in the United States. It is not just on political grounds that we oppose this man. We oppose him on the basis that he abuses women's rights and allows violations in prisons by those that obey the direct orders that are coming from the Ministry of Interior, the minister who reports to General Sisi. So I think the message is clear. What our campaign needs to be about is both political, but it is about also pointing a finger at all those who violate women's rights. I think I'm going to stop here so that we then move on to recommendations. Thank you very much.
If you guys want to sit down, we can start. I prepared one question for Mona, and that is how easy or how difficult is it to get information from the ground in Egypt? How accessible are the people, and how willing are the people to actually talk?
Thank you very much for your question, Sima. So in this day and age, everything is available online. So most of the information I have actually mentioned is available online. So people are willing to speak up. Since the revolution in 2011, people are not scared anymore. The regime, as Maha mentioned, is trying to intimidate us. The regime doesn't want to be exposed, but the people want to speak up. Some people are scared, some people are intimidated, many people are threatened if they speak up. But the reality is, it is 2014, and at this day and age, people actually want to speak up and want the reality to come out. One of the things I'd like to mention, actually, to follow up on what Maha's, now I have the mic, I can say what I want to say. Maha has mentioned Sisi is complicit to a crime against women. But we shouldn't forget that in 2011, Sisi came out for the first time on TV, justifying virginity testing against female protesters. He is a man who should not be celebrated. He is a man who was apologetic to virginity testing for women. just because they were protesting. So this is a man, and it's a whole regime that brought up a man like that, who would want to repress and oppress women. So, yes.
Does anybody from the floor, any questions, please? Okay.
Hi, just a question for the media. First, thank you much for coming here today and supporting our group. Secondly, we are very sorry about what happened to you in Egypt. All the Egyptians, say thank you very much for supporting you. Thirdly, we'd like to say, or would like to know from you, after what happened to you in Egypt, we know that it's normal for Egyptian, for Sisi regime, what he done to you, it's normal for him. But what is American action, American government action after the go from Cairo to Washington by broken arm, whatever? This is one. What is the reaction? Secondly, there is a complaint from Muhammad Salah, is Egyptian American citizen, which is held in Egypt prison for almost 1 year, and he is in hunger strike at the moment. What can you do as Americans to support one of your citizens is held in Egypt? Thirdly, as Dr. Mahazan asked to say, what can you do to stop Sisi making his speech in the United Nations when he comes in with America? Thank you very much.
So the first question is, what did the U.S. government do about the way that I was treated by the Egyptian authorities? I had to call the U.S. State Department every day after I got home to try to get an answer. It took about 6 weeks before I got any answer, and finally they gave me a written response that said that they had tried to get to the airport where I was being held, but the Egyptian authorities would not let them inside. I thought, for over $1 billion, we ought to have a little more leverage than that. And I didn't quite believe the story. But I also have asked them to ask the Egyptian government for an apology, and I have had no response from that.
We have a very strong case. Why don't have a case in court against Egyptian government?
So the question is, why don't I have a case in the court against the Egyptian government? I have been told that the Egyptian government won't even respond to any kind of court case, but as a symbolic kind of thing, I think it's a good idea. Actually, it's something I've been thinking about, and I might pursue that when I get back home. The second question was about Mohammed Sultan, who is an American citizen. He is dying. He is dying in Egyptian prisons. He's been on a hunger strike for over 200 days now, and we are not only in close contact with his family, but we have gone with them to the State Department, to people in Congress, and it is amazing how little the U.S. government will do for him. The only thing they've done is push the Egyptian government to give the family access to him, to get him to a hospital in the prison, but they've done nothing to get him released. So this is another example of what the U.S., how the U.S. is not pressing the case of a 27-year-old U.S. citizen being so horribly treated by the Egyptian regime. And the last was about what can we do about Sisi speaking at the UN. And I must admit that this is something that has slipped by me, and I'm so glad that Ma has brought that up. We will certainly, when I go back, be contacting the Egyptian groups, the human rights organizations, the women's groups, to make sure that we have a vigorous protest both before the UN starts to say he should not even be let on U.S. soil, and if he is let on U.S. soil, he should be immediately arrested. But in the case where he does make it, to make sure that there is a vigorous protest outside.
Any other questions? Yeah.
complicity, on the issue of complicity, I want to talk in regards to the UK. They seem to call themselves the leaders of this democratic so-called world. So essentially my argument would be they too are complicit in these violations of human rights. What suggestions do you have in making sure myself, British citizen, I feel like my government is complicit in the rape of these women, the abuses of these children, etc.?
Let me try to answer this important question. I think that's where the campaigning starts and where an initiative like this is very important. I think you need to coordinate, or we need to coordinate with different groups in the UK, women's groups and rights groups, to pressure and to inform MPs as a start, not only our local MPs, but to start visiting MPs as women's delegations, or as this group in particular, to make them aware of the situation, and to say that a term that I always use here in regard to Egypt and to British policy, not in our name. We do not want you to support a regime that violates women's rights and the rights of its citizens to such a level and has committed what constitute crimes against humanity against its people. We, as British citizens, do not want our government to continue having relations with such a state and to continue normalizing relations and to have both trade in arms and diplomatic relations with a regime that has committed crimes against humanity. So I think the campaign starts amongst each citizen in his or her own country, engaging with rights groups, women's groups, MPs, and petitioning government in order, and on student campuses as the universities open, to ensure that there is an ever-growing campaign and to connect with other campaigns related to human rights. I think that would be some of the first steps that should be taken.